an array of familiar faces cheering the marching troops in Red Square. More than 24 world leaders in Moscow to commemorate the 80th anniversary of victory over Nazi Germany.
A nation ready to mark the 80th anniversary of the defeat of the Nazis and bring an end to Europe's involvement in World War II. Security is as tight as ever, with more than 24 international leaders attending, a sign Moscow still carries weight and influence in global affairs. Western leaders used to also attend, but since the conflict in Ukraine, they have stayed away.
They tell us today that Russia is the greatest threat to Europe. NATO's own strategic documents describe Moscow as the most significant and direct danger to European security. But if you rewind the tape 80 years, the picture flips. The state we now call Russia, then the core of the Soviet Union, was the blunt instrument that smashed Hitler's war machine, lost tens of millions of lives, and raised the red flag over Berlin. So how did yesterday's key ally against fascism become today's permanent villain? Was history simply forgotten, or was it edited on purpose? And who benefits when generations grow up believing that only the West saved Europe from Hitler? This is Liberation Lens. Perspective matters. In this episode, we go back to the Eastern Front, to the ruins of Europe, and to the propaganda labs of the early Cold War to ask a simple question. Who really saved Europe from Hitler, and why was that memory rewritten? Let's start with the version of World War II most people in the West are taught. When many Western audiences picture the war in Europe, the mental map is familiar. D-Day, American GIs on the Normandy beaches, British Spitfires in the skies, the liberation of Paris, US, British, and French forces pushing toward Germany. All of that happened. All of that matters. But what usually gets squeezed into a paragraph, if it's mentioned at all, is this. The main war against Nazi Germany was not fought in Normandy or the Ardennes. It was fought from Leningrad to Stalingrad, from Kursk to Berlin, a front thousands of kilometers long where entire cities were ground to dust. Historians estimate that around 27 million Soviet citizens died in World War II, soldiers and civilians together. That's more than 50 times the American war dead. Whole regions were depopulated. Some villages in Belarus and Western Russia lost the vast majority of their people. This is not a side theater. This is the central battlefield of European fascism. Yet in many Western schoolbooks, the Eastern Front appears as a blurry backdrop, a few lines about heavy fighting in the East, and then back to Omaha Beach. So what actually happened there? In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Millions of German soldiers and their allies stormed into the Soviet Union. This wasn't just a military campaign. It was colonial and genocidal by design. Nazi planners openly described the East as living space to be cleared. Slavic peoples were treated as expendable. Jews were targeted for extermination. Occupied Soviet territory became a laboratory of mass murder long before most Western publics even heard the word Holocaust. The early months were catastrophic for the USSR. Whole Soviet armies were encircled. Millions of prisoners of war were taken, many left to starve. German forces closed in on Moscow and laid siege to Leningrad. From the outside, it looked like the Soviet Union might collapse. But this is where the story starts to turn. From late 1942 into early 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad became the turning point. German forces were encircled in a frozen, ruined city. An entire German army was destroyed or captured. Many historians describe Stalingrad as the moment when the myth of Nazi invincibility finally shattered. Months later came Kursk, often called the largest tank battle in history. German forces tried one last massive offensive. Soviet forces absorbed the blow, then counterattacked and pushed the German lines back. After Kursk, the strategic initiative passed definitively to the Red Army. From that point on, the question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how long it would take, and how much more of Europe would burn along the way. Between 1944 and 1945, Soviet forces pushed west across Eastern Europe. They rolled through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and the Balkans, smashing German armies in successive offensives. In the final months of the war, it was primarily Soviet troops who fought street by street into Berlin, taking enormous casualties to force Nazi Germany's final surrender. Even Western leaders at the time admitted this. Winston Churchill, who loathed communism, still acknowledged that it was the Soviet army that tore the guts out of the German war machine. So if the historical record is so clear, why do so many Western narratives center themselves and push the Eastern Front to the margins? To answer that, we have to leave the battlefield and look at what happened after In 1945, the Allies stood together on victory platforms. By 1949, former Allies were organizing rival blocs. In just a few years, the Soviet Union went from indispensable partner to primary enemy. In the West, this shift had a name: the Cold War. One of the key tools in that shift was economic power. In 1948, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive program to rebuild Western Europe with billions of dollars in grants and loans. On the surface, it was humanitarian reconstruction. But historians and policy documents make it clear that it was also designed to lock Western Europe into an American-led economic system, prevent communist parties from gaining power, and create loyal markets for U.S. industry. The Soviet Union was invited into the Marshall Plan, but rejected the offer, condemning it as a form of dollar imperialism. Moscow then built its own parallel economic network in Eastern Europe. From that point on, Europe was divided not just by borders, but by story. In the Western camp, the dominant public narrative emphasized American industrial might, the heroism of D-Day, and the generosity of the Marshall Plan. The Soviet role in defeating Hitler was not denied, but it was steadily decentered. Instead of the Soviet Union saved Europe from Hitler, a new storyline was promoted. The Free West, led by America, rescued Europe from both fascism and the threat of Soviet domination. The same state that had just lost tens of millions of people fighting Nazism was now framed as the next existential danger to Europe's freedom. At the same time, the Soviet Union was tightening its control over Eastern Europe, crushing opposition, installing communist governments, and building its own version of empire. People in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltics had their own memories of Soviet liberation turning into Soviet domination. Those experiences were real. But here's the key point. The way Western publics came to see the USSR, and later Russia, was shaped not only by Soviet actions, but by how Western elites chose to remember World War II. 3 moves stand out. First, the center of the story shifted westward. Popular films, school curricula, and anniversary speeches focused on the Battle of Britain, D-Day, and the liberations in France and the Low Countries. The titanic struggles of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, Kursk, the road to Berlin, became secondary if they were discussed at all. If you grow up seeing only that version, it's natural to think that the war was mainly won by Anglo-American forces, with the Soviets in a supporting role. Second, Soviet victory was recast as Soviet threat. As the Iron Curtain descended, the Red Army's presence in Eastern Europe was no longer remembered primarily as the force that had driven out Hitler's troops, but as a new occupation. Western leaders and media drew parallels between Nazi and Soviet totalitarianism. In much of Eastern Europe, people living under communist regimes agreed with that framing. But in the wider Western public sphere, the nuance disappeared, and the Soviet Union was presented as an almost timeless menace, replacing Nazi Germany as the main villain in the story of freedom. Third, that edited memory helped justify new institutions. NATO, founded in 1949, openly defined itself against the Soviet threat. The alliance's identity was built on the idea that only a united Western bloc could prevent another catastrophe in Europe. Every new crisis, from Berlin to Korea to Afghanistan, reinforced the storyline that we stood for security and liberty, and they stood for aggression and repression. Over decades, this narrative hardened into common sense. Fast forward to today. Since Russia's occupation of Crimea in 2014 and its full-scale war against Ukraine in 2022, Western governments and think tanks once again describe Moscow as the main military danger to Europe. NATO's latest strategic concept calls Russia the most significant and direct threat to Allied security. Western analysts warn that if Ukraine falls, the Baltic states or Poland could be next. At the same time, in mainstream coverage, you hear relatively little about the historical trauma of Nazi invasion inside Russia and the former Soviet Union. The fact that Russian families still mark Victory Day as a sacred remembrance of unimaginable sacrifice rarely enters Western debate about deterrence, sanctions, and NATO deployments. Why does that matter? Because when you erase or minimize someone's sacrifices in your story, it becomes easier to portray them as a permanent enemy. Once that frame is set, every conflict looks like just another chapter in one long saga of Russian aggression, and every Western move, from expanding NATO to arming Ukraine, can be marketed as pure defense, even when it clearly contributes to escalation. Our Liberation Lens view doesn't ask you to romanticize the Soviet Union or excuse current Russian policy. It asks you to hold multiple truths at once. The first truth is that the Soviet Union was absolutely decisive in defeating Nazi Germany. Without the Red Army's resistance at Stalingrad and Kursk, without its relentless advance through Eastern Europe, the outcome of the war in Europe could have looked very different and far darker. The second truth is that the Soviet system was deeply repressive, and that millions of people in Eastern Europe experienced Soviet liberation as the beginning of another kind of domination. The third truth is that Western powers used money, media, and institutions like the Marshall Plan and NATO to build a strategic narrative in which freedom lives only on one side of the Iron Curtain, and that narrative still shapes how Europeans and North Americans see Russia today. So we have to ask, who benefits from a Europe that remembers every Western sacrifice in vivid detail, but barely remembers 27 million Soviet dead? Who gains when the only stories we know are America saved the world and Russia is the eternal threat? And what happens to smaller nations, from Ukraine to the countries of the global South, when they are turned into battlefields between these competing myths? Because if we don't interrogate the story, we end up fighting yesterday's ghosts on today's soil. We end up with a world where NATO rearms in the name of never again. Russia wraps its own wars in the symbolism of 1945, and ordinary people in Kyiv, Donetsk, Moscow, Warsaw, Berlin pay the price for conflicts wrapped in recycled narratives. The lesson from World War II should not be trust one empire over another. The lesson should be never outsource your memory. Study who actually fought. Study who actually died. Study who actually rebuilt and why. Only then can you start to see through the slogans and decide for yourself what security, justice, and peace should look like. If this challenged what you were taught, don't stop here. Go and read about the Eastern Front. Listen to voices from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, the Balkans, and beyond. Compare the stories. Notice what is emphasized and what is left out. Because in a world where memory is a weapon, knowledge is self-defense. This is Liberation Lens Perspective Matters. See you in the next episode.